Hello, this is Kevin Annett, and I'm speaking to you from Davis, California. I am here today to talk about two of my new books having to do with genocide in Canada, but also the broader crime of child trafficking, crimes against humanity by church and state. The first thing I want to talk to you is a series of incidents in Canada where we began to uncover the remains of children who had actually been killed or died in Indian boarding schools. Now, I know of this topic because for the last 25 years, I have been in the forefront of a campaign to document and expose these crimes and also prosecute those responsible in the Catholic, United, and Anglican churches, the Government of Canada, and the Crown of England and the Vatican. And in the course of interviewing many hundreds of eyewitnesses to these crimes, I realized that we weren't just talking about the kinds of crimes that are allowed to be in the corporate media all the time. For example, crimes of the physical and sexual abuse of children are thoroughly reported, but what aren't covered ever in the so-called mainstream media is the fact that those were tips of the iceberg. The main crimes against Native children, both in the United States and Canada, had to do with a concerted plan of genocide, of how to wipe out entire nations by attacking their children. We know that from the records that I've unearthed and published in books like this latest, Murder by Decree, The Crime of Genocide in Canada. Many of the documents in here show that the average death rate in the Indian boarding schools was over 50%, over half a century. And with that enormous death rate, it's not the result of random acts of abusers. There's a whole plan of using germ warfare, spreading tuberculosis and smallpox among children and then never treating them. That was a standard practice in these so-called schools. And so the death rate was enormous. The body count was over 50,000 plus children who never came back from these places, and a much even higher level among American Indian schools from the limited research I've done. The question that faced our investigation early on was, where are these children? Where are they buried? We know in many cases from eyewitnesses, from written accounts that we published, reports of Indian agents and others, that the standard way of getting rid of dead children was to actually burn them up, incinerate them in the furnaces of these Indian schools. We have that from eyewitnesses. If you go to our site, itccs.org, that's the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State, itccs.org, you'll see an eyewitness account there from a Cree woman, Irene Favel, who, as a little girl, actually saw a newborn baby thrown into a furnace by a Catholic priest at an Indian school in Saskatchewan in 1944. We have many of those kinds of witnesses who buried children, who helped incinerate the remains, that kind of thing. But nevertheless, early on, we know that it was more commonly the practice of actually burying children on the grounds of the school. We've documented 28 mass grave sites in Canada alone, mostly in Western Canada, where hundreds of the remains of children were buried. Now, one of the things that prompted us to publish this book, Murder by Decree, this year, is that the Canadian government deliberately censored out many of the records of those killings and has downplayed the level of murder in these schools. For example, the Canadian government's so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission claims that only 3,000 or 4,000 children died over a century. Now, that would require a death rate of between 1% and 2%, an absurdly low figure, since their own records, which we published, show that 40 to 50 to 60% was the norm. So they're even contradicting their own records. Early on in the first half century of the Indian schools, so that was from around the 1880s to after World War II, or around the time of World War II, the standard practice is to bury the children on the grounds of the school. And as a result of that, we were invited, and I was invited personally, by the Mohawk tribe near Brantford, Ontario, in the late months of 2011, to come and, with the full authorization of 10 elders of the Grand River Mohawks, I was asked to come and investigate the site of the Indian boarding school mass grave site there. And we brought in forensic specialists. We surveyed the grounds with ground-penetrating radar, found massive soil dislocation right on the very spot that eyewitnesses said they had helped bury children. And with the authority of Bill and Cheryl Squire, the authorizing elders, we began to conduct an archaeological excavation there. Within about 2 hours of digging on the site where those children were buried, we uncovered the remains of bones and school buttons off the school uniforms. These bones were sent, there were 16 separate bones. They were sent off to the Smithsonian Institute. Dr. Don Ortner examined them, and he said in a series of emails to me, which again we published, he said that he was 95% sure several of these bones were from the body of a small child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, probably a girl. And he wanted very much to come and investigate further. The Mohawks wanted him to come up. He was scheduled to come up, and then 2 months later he died of a sudden heart attack. Whether that's coincidental or not, I'll leave it to you to figure out. But he was the first top-level forensic pathologist who was scheduled to come and actually examine this first excavation of Indian residential school gravesite in history. Now, soon after these bones were surfaced and we went public with them, there was an enormous campaign to shut down the dig. In fact, it happened after about a week. The government-funded Indians of the Six Nations Confederacy, Chief Bill Montour, came in and ordered everyone to stop cooperating in the dig, even though initially he had supported it. Played lip service to, this call to bring home the remains of these children who were killed. The government funded Royal Canadian Mounted Police, closed off the site, didn't allow anyone in on it, and there was an enormous misinformation and smear campaign started in the internet about me and the whole elder authorized dig that had gone on there. So in effect, not surprisingly, the criminals of church and state shut down the hard evidence of their crime. But that doesn't, in fact, stop what happened. It confirmed that, yes, there are children buried in the ground. They're still there. We know that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have gone around and systematically unearthed and destroyed many of these sites. And in a broader sense, the Canadian government has even authorized the destruction of all evidence, including documents. We know that because just this month in April 2016, the Ontario Court of Appeal in Canada actually authorized the Canadian government to destroy any evidence of residential school testimonies in their possession. So in effect, if you can believe this, one of the highest courts in Canada has said it's okay to destroy evidence from a crime scene, the biggest crime scene in Canadian history involving the mass murder of Indian children. So it shows you that the government is actively concealing their crimes, and especially the crimes at these mass grave sites. And we know it's in direct response to the publishing of this work, Murder by Decree, because in it, as you'll notice if you go to the site on murderbydecree.com, you'll see there a lot of the evidence that the government in fact censored out. The eyewitness testimonies, the records showing that half the children died in these schools consistently, decade after decade. That was a plan of extermination under the guise of religion and education to get the lands and the resources. And that's not unusual. It happens all over the world. If people are surprised it happens in Canada, it's only because they're ignorant of Canadian history, the real history, and are taken in by this beneficent image that Canada likes to project to the world. We know, in fact, that the mass murder of Indians in Canada happened even more effectively than in the United States because it happened more secretly and under the guise and the control primarily of the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of England, and the United Church of Canada, which was my former church that expelled me when I began to uncover these things. So stage 2 of this whole story is the fact that after the shutdown of that Mohawk dig we conducted, we were invited to Europe with that evidence, and the next year in 2012, we began an international common law court trial into these crimes using this evidence from the Mohawk dig and many of the other documents that we published. So I'll be discussing that in a separate YouTube posting, but I think it's very important for people to realize that these crimes are ongoing. We've documented it, itccs.org, murderbydecree.com, and we are continuing the investigation into the further disappearance of Aboriginal women and children that's happening all over Canada, but especially in Western Canada, at the behest of foreign corporate interests, Chinese and American companies that are forcing Native people off their land to get the uranium, the oil, the water, the hydroelectric power. So please follow the work at itccs.org, and stay tuned for further postings about these vital issues. This is Kevin Annett. I thank you. Hello, it's Kevin Annett again. I'm in Davis, California, and I'm going to talk for a little bit today about how our movement to expose genocide in Canada went to Europe and helped set up the first International Common Law Court of Justice, and how it is that common law can be used as a real weapon by the people of any community to fight their oppression, to fight the abuse of their rights, their children's rights, any issue that's harming their liberties and their well-being. For me, the whole issue of common law was kind of abstract. I had studied it when I took some year of law school, but I didn't really understand the power of common law until I had to be in a situation where we were confronting both church and state in Canada for their proven crimes of genocide. For many years, we attempted to bring these cases of the murder of Aboriginal children into Canadian courts, and we were rebuffed time and again with the same argument. We were told that courts in Canada had no authority to put their boss, if you like, the Crown of England, the one who had appointed these judges, to put those groups on trial. In effect, so-called sovereign leaders of church and state could not be tried. Now, that was inaccurate, of course, because under international law, anyone can be tried for a crime against humanity, or even for any kind of tort or civil offense. But what we realized was there was a lot of political forces at work to stop that from happening. So I mentioned previously how we uncovered evidence of the murder of Indian children at the Mohawk Indian School, including physical remains that we had unearthed. The next year, we were summoned to Europe to bring that evidence before an international tribunal. And when that tribunal looked at that hard evidence, including documentation and testimonies from people showing clearly that genocide had been committed, they were looking for a technique and a method for how do you put heads of church and state on trial. Not just trying individuals, but how do you put a whole institution and mindset on trial, that whole culture, if you like, that was responsible for the mass murder of children and that continues to perpetrate genocide around the world. What the answer was that it's possible to invoke common law to convene a court to do exactly that. So the first step was easy. We had a lot of evidence. We had the eyewitnesses and the documentation, and really those two factors is all you need in any court of law. And we also needed the structure. So what we did is we established a genuine court of record with 58 citizen jurors. Now, we put out the call for citizen jurors by publishing what's called a notice of claim of right, where we stated the case that these perpetrators had committed crimes. We named 30 defendants, including Pope Benedict, who subsequently resigned as a result of this case, which is not accidental, Queen Elizabeth, the Prime Minister of Canada, and many levels, officials of church and state. These people were summoned into the court. None of them responded, which was an admission of guilt under the law, and it was considered that by the court. And there was a prosecutor's office set up that really their job was to gather the evidence and the case. And the chief prosecutor actually presented the case to the citizen prosecutors, or rather the citizen jurors. They were in 9 different countries, so they were linked by Skype call, which was perfectly legal. You can do that in a court. They don't have to all be physically present. Although with local common law courts, we urge, because it's local action, that people in fact do have a physical location where it's established like a regular court. But in this case, the International Common Law Court operated that way. The case went on for 3.5 months, and the evidence was exhaustive. And again, there was no attempt by the defendants to ever respond. We even invited them to help in the jury selection, to respond as well to the evidence. They never did. They did not contest the evidence against them, which is very important legally. And after 3.5 months, the 58 citizen jurors decided unanimously that yes, They were all guilty on the 2 counts of the indictment, which was committing crimes of genocide against whole cultures and against children, and concealing that crime in a criminal conspiracy to destroy or subvert evidence, in effect to obstruct justice. All of the people named by the citizen jurors were found guilty. The verdict was that they were sentenced to 25 years in prison in absentia with no possibility of parole, and that all of their property and assets were forfeited. Now that's very significant because it meant that the Crown of England, the head of the Roman Catholic Church and others had lost their authority to govern, and it meant legally that anyone at that point could go in and seize the assets and property of those corporations lawfully. Now, in the arrest warrants that were issued, it authorized any citizen to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, Pope Benedict resigned within 2 weeks of that verdict coming down, because even though most of the people of the world don't realize it, the heads of those corporations know that the verdict of a common law court can be acted upon by any court in the world. So all of a sudden, any court in any country could take the evidence and issue arrest warrants. So it really wasn't, people were saying to us, well, have you arrested the Pope yet? Well, no, it isn't our job with our meager resources to do that. We prove the case. But any police agency in the world can. And that's the power of these court verdicts, common law court verdicts, because any government and court around the world can then act on it. And so it's like a loaded gun that we're handing to the world. And these heads of church and state know it, which is why they've stayed out of sight very much since these verdicts have come down. They don't know whether or not the people of the world will act on this, because the thing about enforcement with the common law court decisions is that every citizen in the world is the enforcer. It isn't up to a sheriff to go in and do it. Any citizen can and should enforce these verdicts. So that's another very powerful aspect about these common law courts. In terms of relating our experience of the common law court in Europe to the work of anyone trying to set up a common law court, there's a couple of things to remember. We were effective because not only did we have the evidence, we had public opinion and we had a lot of media exposure. And so we were able to build a real groundswell. We didn't act in a vacuum. We were able to bring immense public pressure to bear on this issue because it had to do with massive child trafficking, proven crimes of genocide. So if you're conducting any kind of court case, let's say on something like smart meters, you've got to have your ducks in order. You've got to have the evidence lined up. You've got to have the witnesses lined up. And you've got to have a clear villain. You've got to have not just the system in general as the defendant. That doesn't work in a common law court. You've got to name individuals. The old saying that evil has an address. You've got to name that address. You've got to name who's responsible and summon them into the court. Then the fiduciary heads of corporations, government leaders. In the case of, for example, chemtrails, you should definitely third party the heads of the companies, the U.S. government, the people who are allowing these crimes to happen. And that's very important. And once you have that evidence, you go public with it. And so you turn the common law court into a great public arena. You invite the public in. You say anyone with evidence, come into court and share that evidence. It's an enormous theater, if you like, but in a good way, in the sense that you are using the one weapon we have as people, which is public exposure in numbers. There's 2 things that any corporation, whether it's church, state, company, whatever, 2 things they fear, and 2 things to which they will respond, regardless of how small you are. A threat to their money and a threat to their public image. And you've got to strike at both. You can't appeal to their conscience. They don't have one. They're a corporation. You can't appeal to somebody in the system to help you, because by and large, as we found with child trafficking, they're all working together in these crimes, and one official will back up the other automatically and will come down on you. So your best protection is public exposure in numbers and embarrassing these people as much as possible, which is very easy to do because they know they're guilty and they are guilty. I document in my book, Unrelenting, Between Sodom and Zion, many of the steps that we used in bringing this common law court into being. So you can get that and our book, Murder by Decree, The Crime of Genocide in Canada. You can get that online at Amazon.com, through our website, itccs.org, murderbydecree.com. Also, for establishing common law courts, there's a very precious resource that we use. It's online at itccs.org. If you look in the right-hand column, it'll say Community Training Manual, Common Law Training Manual, and the first draft of how to go through the steps, the 12 steps of setting up a common law court. People in Davis have copies of that. We'll be issuing new versions of that, and actually in pamphlet or manual form for people to disseminate and learn from and add to based on your own experiences. But in terms of those 12 steps, it's very important to first issue the statement of claim of right that says, here's the case, here's the defendants, here is what they're guilty of, and that's the basis upon which you issue a call for jury members and start the ball rolling. It's important to remember in the case of in the course of the common law trial that it's conducted like all the norms of any other court, with a prosecutor. Now the judge doesn't have the power that they have in these corporate de facto courts, where they can rewrite court records, dismiss juries. They're gods unto themselves. Judges are magistrates in a common law system. That is, they're legal advisors to the jury. They don't have the right to do any of that stuff. They are bound by the decision of the jury, and the jury, in fact, can even rewrite the law, can make a decision that some law may not be valid and should be chucked out. The people are empowered by the jury system to be the lawmakers, not just the legislators, but the jury members themselves. The citizens can directly make the law, and that's one of the very important aspects of the common law court. And also a very important thing, there are no lawyers. People represent themselves. You cannot be represented by another human being. If you have a case you want to bring, you have to be able to argue that case openly before the world, and the person accused has to come and answer those charges. So there's no intermediary where a lawyer can be, the lawyer and judge run courts are a big part of the problem. So, that's kind of in a nutshell the philosophy and the direction of a common law court. And don't forget, the verdict of a common law court has the force of law, and a police officer is obligated to enforce it. So if your common law court has decided that chemtrails are unconstitutional and are a threat to the health of people, the police have to go in and stop that chemtrail from operating, or they're colluding in a crime and they have to stand down. They're violating their oath of office, they're not being peace officers, and we have the right to appoint common law sheriffs to take their place. And in fact, the part of the establishment of the court involves the appointing of common law bailiffs and sheriffs to issue the warrants, to maintain peace in the court, to defend the jury in case they're attacked, to defend the viability of the court, and to make the arrests. So the common law sheriff is a very important and powerful figure in this whole process, just as in America, the county sheriffs have immense power to convene juries and remove corrupt judges, that kind of thing. That's why we need to get the sheriffs who exist now on board, bringing them into our training programs, our workshops, and teach them about the common law to get them on board and assist our common law courts. So again, if you want to read up on any of this, there'll be more workshops. I'll be coming back to Davis and the area throughout the spring and summer of 2016 to help conduct these workshops and set up common law courts on many different issues. And that's my personal pledge that I will be doing that. But until then, follow that common law training manual at itccs.org. If you want to get a hold of me, I'm at hiddenfromhistory1@gmail.com. And this is Kevin Annett. Thank you very much.